Well, good evening. My name is Ted Landsmark. I am the director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy at Northeastern University in Boston. You have joined the Open Classroom, where this semester we've been discussing the multiple ways in which design can have a positive impact on communities and community building. And we're doing that this semester in conjunction with the Bruner Foundation. We remind folks that if you have questions or comments, we invite you to post those in our chat box, and we will get to as many of those as we can over the course of this call. And with that, I'm happy to turn the screen over to my colleague, Anne-Marie Lubenow of the Bruner Foundation. Anne-Marie, you're on.
Thank you, Ted. As Ted mentioned, my name's Anne-Marie Lubenow, and I'm the director of the Rudy Bruner Award for Urban Excellence at the Bruner Foundation. And we're pleased to be collaborating with the Myra Kraft Open Classroom this semester to explore how cities across America are addressing challenges through design. The Rudy Bruner Award is a national urban design award that recognizes transformative places that contribute to the economic, environmental, and social vitality of American cities. We are tapping into our network of 88 places that have received the award, for which we also have detailed case studies that are available on our website. So tonight's session, we're going to explore the role of housing in supporting the health and well-being of residents and communities. We're going to learn about Via Verde in New York City, a 2013 Rudy Bruner Award Silver Medalist, which is an innovative 222-unit affordable housing development in the Bronx. The project is the product of an international design competition created to spark new thinking about the design of affordable housing. It was sponsored by the American Institute of Architects, New York, in partnership with New York City Council and the University of New York. We're also going to be hear about initiatives and projects here in Boston and elsewhere that are engaging architects, developers, public agencies, and communities in creating innovative housing solutions. And for the architects in the audience tonight, this session is eligible for AIA CEUs. We're going to put a link in the chat box that you can use to submit your name and member number. And that's thanks to the Boston Society of Architects. And tonight's presenters include Karen Kubey, who's an urbanist specializing in housing and health. She's the editor of the book, Housing as Intervention, Architecture Towards Social Equity, and is a visiting associate professor at the Pratt Institute. Karen co-founded and co-led the New Housing New York design competition that led to the development of Via Verde. We'll also hear from Brian Phillips, who's a founding principal of ISA, or Interface Studio Architects, where he serves as creative director for the firm's design and research efforts. He and his firm have won numerous local, regional, and national awards, and their work has been featured in many publications, including Architect, Metropolis, and the Boston Globe. Brian's also a lecturer and teaches a graduate urban housing design studio at the University of Pennsylvania. And Wandy Pascoal is a Housing Innovation Fellow with both the Boston Society of Architects and the City of Boston's Housing Innovation Lab. Trained as an architect and a native of Angola, she's interested in the intersection between housing and policy. In her current role, she strives to center the voices of residents in the design and implementation of housing development. Tonight, we're going to take a format similar to what we did last week, where we'll start with brief presentations from Karen, Brian, and Wandy about their respective work. Then we'll pivot to a conversation with the three of them, each asking each other questions before turning to Q&A from the audience. Please remember to put your questions in the box, and we look forward to an engaging conversation. So now I'm going to turn this over to Karen, Brian, and Wandy. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie and Ted. I love this format of the Open Classroom, and I've been watching the series, and I'm so honored to be part of it. I will share my screen. Okay. Sorry. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I will be presenting Via Verde toward healthy housing for all. And the starting point for this project and all of my work is that housing justice is racial justice and that housing is healthcare. So tonight we're talking about how design of housing can promote health equity. I'm going to be talking first about the competition that Anna Marie just mentioned, New Housing New York. So I was not the designer of the beautiful housing you see here, but I helped to design the competition, and I'm going to talk about how that worked and what I think the lessons are that we can pull forward. So it starts here. This is the future site of Via Verde. It's a 40,000 square foot brownfield in the South Bronx. And I'm representing this group, the steering committee that came together to organize the competition. So it's a huge, I'm one person. I was the first chair, joined by a couple of other co-chairs to organize this effort. We're representing a huge number of people. And as Anna Marie mentioned, a huge number of organizations coming together to make this happen. And also this didn't start from nowhere. This was building on an earlier competition that was an ideas competition from 2004. So what was our goal? Why did we want to do this? Our goal with the New Housing New York competition was to challenge architect developer teams from around the world to create housing that would be affordable, sustainable, and replicable. And I should note, I'm very excited that it feels pretty straightforward and maybe a little boring to argue that housing should be both affordable and sustainable in 2021. But at the moment when we were developing this competition, the designers and developers of affordable housing were in a totally different room, maybe a different universe from people doing sustainable architecture. Many people thought that it was too expensive, we shouldn't ask for that. So that was our huge argument. We said, no, housing must be both affordable and sustainable at once. And we wanted to show that it could be done, and it could be done beautifully. So I'll dive into the main way that we achieved that. Again, we're working in a very unsexy way, unglamorous way. We're working on the process, the procurement process, really, that can get you to good design. And this is, I think, I won't be able to go into the nitty gritty in our short presentation today, but I think this was the most important thing we did, which is to offer weighted criteria. The city had not done this before, to put design at the top, to also say green building is very important, as important as whether it pencils. So here we are, we're in the South Bronx, above Manhattan, and the site is by the hub, so it's very well served by public transportation. And as you can see, I showed you a picture of the brownfield. It's this very long, narrow, triangular site. And we're talking about health equity today. This is especially critical in this neighborhood. This is, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but up here, it's a neighborhood with low incomes and mostly people of color, and unfortunately experiencing high rates of diseases like diabetes and obesity, and also unfortunately seeing lower life expectancies than richer and whiter neighborhoods in New York. And we know that the best predictor of our health is where we live, which is why it's so important for people involved in developing the built environment to focus on health equity. So why did we want to do a design competition? We were inspired by an earlier era's health issues with housing and their successes. So looking at the turn of the century, you had overcrowding connected to diseases like tuberculosis. And a famous competition, the tenement design competition, came around, and the result was this barbell or dumbbell, excuse me, tenement design, which let in more light and air than the previous standard for filling up the whole block, basically. And importantly, this was not just a nice design that architects loved. This was built into the building codes, and it produced healthier housing for everyone. So how do we center community needs in our process? We started by working very closely with the local community board in the South Bronx and conducting a series of workshops with people there, developing a list of prioritized community priorities. So those went straight into the RFQ, RFP, and those were the metrics that our jury used and codified also in the criteria I showed you earlier. That's how the entries were judged. It said, okay, are these meeting the community needs? So this is the winner, Via Verde, or the Green Way. You can see the basic diagram on the right and the idea of incorporating healthy food on the left. And the winning team is on the developing side, Phillips and Rose, and on the architecture side, Datner and Grimshaw. But of course, the story does not end here, because we've all seen competitions that have a beautiful winner and then you see the results and it looks nothing like it. So there was a ton of work to be done after the international search resulted in such a beautiful project. And in particular, what you're seeing is something really important, which was a joint review committee that came together of different agencies across the city, so that if there was a conflict or anything, they could really make sure that good design was prioritized in the development process. So here's the groundbreaking, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Via Verde. So as mentioned, here's the full names of the winning team, to a partnership on the development side and on the architecture side. So developers being Phillips, which is the oldest nonprofit developer in the city, and Jonathan Rose, which really foregrounds green design, working with Datner, a very solid firm doing excellent work in New York, with Grimshaw, known more for sort of fancier projects, coming from London. So this is a 222 unit development. It's a mix of ownership and rental, with the rental being 30 to 60% of AMI, and the ownership being 70 to 100. And so here you can see the main diagram for the Green Way, where you can step up from steps in the courtyard and walk most of the way up to these towers. So it's taking advantage of the sunlight. And so it's on the northern end that you go all the way up to a 20-story tower, and seeing some of the green features like rainwater storage and gardens. So here's a nice shot at night. You can see into the courtyard there, and it's sort of advertising its greenness with these solar panels, etc. And also some really lovely interiors, and with something as sort of straightforward as a ceiling fan. And this, you can't tell, but this was actually involved in changing regulations for the city. So we're talking about healthy housing today. What makes Via Verde healthy? So some of this is very basic and true of all well-designed, affordable housing. We know from better and better research that housing directly affects our health. And specifically, when people are provided with housing that they can afford, meaning technically for this case, 30% of your income or less, and high quality housing, your mental and physical health improves, and you miss less school, you miss less work, you feel better. But what specifically is going on with Via Verde? You have accessible green roofs, a gym, and community spaces for residents. You have a shared courtyard for play. We know that social cohesion is an important determinant of health. And you have a roof garden growing healthy foods. This is all, of course, in addition. The whole thing is kind of an exercise, piece of exercise equipment in a way. And here's a shot of the ground floor plan. On the left, bottom left there is a ground floor health clinic. And at the level of the unit, you have apartments that have cross ventilation. But the big question everyone asks is, yes, that sounds nice, Karen, but is it replicable? And this is something I explore further in an article I wrote for Domus that also published in German in Bauwelt. And I think it's really important to look at replicability in terms of the influences this project has had in different ways. So this is really exciting because if you remember, the goals were to be affordable and sustainable. So the winning project really went beyond our sort of wildest dreams of what this could be by really showing to everyone, and this was also a huge lesson for me personally, to learn and think about how housing can be an intervention toward greater health equity. And so this became, importantly, in terms of influence, this was a test case for New York City's active design guidelines, which originally came out in 2010, that show strategies in the built environment to promote physical health. So this is a test case and inspiring further work in tons of projects across the city since. Also, I mentioned Enterprise Community Partners was a supporter of the project, and they are always taking in inputs from their built work into the Green Communities Guidelines, which influences healthier housing across the country. And then, in the image, you might have noticed, some of you politicos might have noticed Sean Donovan, who was then the head of the housing department in New York, also the head of the jury, and then went on to lead HUD under Obama, where he developed Rebuild by Design, which he called New Housing New York on steroids. So taking this design competition and, another way that it influences things at the national scale is to think about, more ways for a healthier building through design competitions. And of course, we were very honored to receive a Silver Medal Award with the Rudy Brunner Award, and excited to see work get out that way and influence people, subject of exhibitions. There's a whole book on it that you can get. And this was really exciting. Michael Kimmelman, in his very first article as architecture editor, features Via Verde. He's not featuring a fancy museum, a fancy rich person's, mansion, but featuring Via Verde. And, this isn't just an ego thing. It's really exciting to see more people talking and about affordable housing and raising the bar. The public conception of what affordable housing should be really is influential. And then what are other ways to think about replicability? I thought it was so interesting when I got to do that article, calling up people who had been involved and learning how the project had influenced their own work. So Holly Light at the housing department noticed that, because it was a big, well-publicized international design competition, lots of architects who had never given a second thought to affordable housing RFPs suddenly knew about them and were signing up. So she saw a huge increase in the quality of design, coming across her desk. And one of her important lessons was, we were very open. Of course, the city has its lawyers, and we were, there are a lot of things that they were quite strict on, but they were also pretty open. And so she, her lesson that she brought forth in more work for the city was that you can really trust designers and developers to respond well if you leave it fairly open. And looking at what does it take to do more of this? Design is not the obstacle. I would also agree with what David Burney says. It's political will, really. And I want to mention, there are some students in the audience. So I thought I'd mention that I was 25 when I ran this competition, and leading a group that included a lot of people twice my age. And I'm talking about the rosy stuff, but also, in our very first meeting, someone, hadn't read the agenda, and he thought it was a terrible idea, and he got up and he stormed out. and a lot of other obstacles we had to overcome. But being young meant that I was lucky because I didn't know how much work this would be. And it also meant that I was, I worked very hard. I had less experience, but I worked very, very hard. And I'm putting this slide up because, I think the final design is as good as it is, partly because of these partnerships. And that was something that I put into the RFP, at 11:30 at night when I was working on it. So, the sort of quiet power of younger people in some of this. And I'll end here. This is something that, Via Verde for me was the first project that really opened my eyes to the connections between housing design and health equity. And, something that I pursue in my teaching and professional and editorial work now. So I'll end here by saying that ethical design for the most impacted by dual climate and public health crises must center their lived experience and cultures. So thanks so much for the opportunity. I look forward to talking with my fellow panelists.
Thank you.
And we've been reminded a couple of times through this series that sometimes you have to start something with a sense of passion, not knowing, as other people will try to tell you, that you're not capable of accomplishing the thing that you end up accomplishing and winning awards for. So it's a reminder to all in our audience that whatever people say that's not possible, in fact, it is often quite possible, and you should go for it. Who's next?
I believe it's me. And I will share. You guys ready? Sorry, I always, it's like you get to see all my slides backwards when I don't have it teed up properly. Power of Zoom. You guys ready? Great. It was great to hear Karen talk, and I always, whenever I follow somebody, I start rethinking how I want to talk about what I'm about to present, and I think I'll do that a little bit. And I think this is sort of a practice design case study maybe today about localisms and housing typologies and the role of the architect in both design, but I think also asking some questions and really being an advocate for your place around the unique issues that we all deal with. And I'll just start by thinking about how New York and Philly are quite different cities. And I think this photo captures it, this sort of the overwhelming sort of role of this sort of gridiron fabric of row houses and this carpet of what I like to think of as three-story sort of repetitive development. And so this fabric and this place was where we sort of started our practice, just asking open questions about how do we kind of participate in the local context. And so, Philadelphia has this sort of relentless grid that keeps breaking down into these sort of smaller pieces, eventually coming to the basic building block, which is this often actually 16 feet generous, sometimes as narrow as 12 feet, which we'll see a little later in some of our work, but very narrow lots that compose these really sort of mini neighborhoods. And the row house is really at the kind of heart of this as the typology. And I think we've also come to know that Philadelphia is really a wildly row house dominated place with some 400,000 of them in a city of 1.5 million, and you do the math. You can see that many Philadelphians live in the row house. And what's interesting about it for us too is, there's a kind of, it captures a wide range of different kinds of people, backgrounds, incomes. The difference between being in a fancy row house or a modest row house could be 2 feet of width. And I think there's a kind of common experience of living kind of in this way, which we found to be compelling. So I think what I want to be able to share today are a couple of examples of sort of design of row houses, and then a sort of grand project we did where we had a chance to kind of dig in and to sort of talk to communities about the experience of the row house. And what's really cool, I was really interesting, Karen, to see the Via Verde Plaza, because I started thinking like row house blocks have that same space and it's the street. And it's this sort of shared common space that we keep coming back to the idea, as much as we're architects thinking about buildings, you can't get away from the power of the stoop and the sidewalk and the street as really this sort of commonly held living room. And there's just unending variety and interest from different eras, different kinds of developers that operated over the last couple of hundred years building these blocks out. And you can kind of see here the sort of way that these spaces get used. In Philadelphia, if I think 3/4 of the residents agree they can close down their block for a block party permit, and pre-pandemic, I think in 2019 there were 7,000 such permits pooled over a 3-month period over the summer. And I think you just get this sense of the kind of social connectedness, and I think the resulting kind of healthy communities that really come out of, again, the kind of spatial typology, the kind of walkability, the kind of shared experience, the relying on your neighbor. That's not to say that there aren't some intense sort of systemic challenges to a lot of people living in the city of Philadelphia, but the space and the typology of the row house we kind of hold on to as a real asset. So I'm just going to quickly, being mindful of time here, go through some really quick row house experiments we've done. The first one being, I think, very much coming out of this idea of affordable and very sustainable. These were all projects we did with private developers, I think maybe piggybacking on maybe Karen's optimism that developers and architects can do innovative things if kind of given the chance. And these houses, which were much smaller than what the zoning envelope would allow, were 1,000 square foot, LEED Platinum, $100 a square foot houses, admittedly built 2008, 2009, 2010 when construction was a little less expensive. But really starting from this idea of what's the smallest, most elemental house we could build. And you can see in this plan, some of the original houses had only 2 doors, one at the front and one on the bathroom. Sometimes we had to put up false walls at bedrooms to get the appraisals that people needed in order to compare to neighboring houses that had separate bedrooms. But this sort of not asking how do we make a cool, interesting house less expensive, how do you start with this high performance sort of type, and what are the design virtues, right? Like these houses were flat, very simple. We silk screened on this facade with an artist to create the architectural character, and just really using what was at hand to kind of create the building. And this was actually the developer and his family. He lived in the first house and really believed in this vision. And we did some half dozen of these original prototypes, and has informed our work since across now, Philadelphia, Detroit. We did a project in Roxbury that came out of this fabric up in Massachusetts, and we've been working around the country with this ethic of learning the local place. You can see all 3 of these buyers rolled a PV array into their mortgage, which we thought was a really interesting commitment by young first-time home buyers and what their values were in housing. More recently, and we've done many of those projects, and more recently we've been very interested in these sort of leftover sites that are too weird, maybe narrow to develop in the first wave. And really, I think as an affordability unlock is really, how do you make the most of the fabric that's there? How do you make the most of the infrastructure that's there? And these next 2 projects are 12 feet and 11 feet wide respectively. This is a 12-foot wide row house. One of the funny things about this developer was when they bought the lot, one of those houses in the background asked him what he was going to do on it, and he said, build a house. And they said, how could you build a house? Because it's 12 feet wide, which new construction in Philadelphia is usually not seeking 12-foot wide houses. And the developer said, well, it used to be a house. And that's really kind of amazing, right? That this expectation of how we live has really changed. And this 1,000 square foot house really had to use the vertical sort of dimension to its advantage. And if you guys know what the Philadelphia Trinity is, which is this 3-story with a stair that goes back to kind of colonial era, we were really inspired by that. Move that stair to the front of the house, almost becomes a big window shade where those windows in the front allow in light, and that stair sort of twists up and serves each of the rooms, which are quite modest, but really builds off the kind of, you can kind of see here from the stair, one of those rooms. And again, really finds the kind of elementalness of what's given to you, which I think is sort of a hallmark of the way that we're trying to solve for this kind of affordable and sustainable housing model, which is to make the most of the fabric available and also to kind of take what's given. And we're not always putting brick on these houses. We're not always trying to look like what's next door, because sometimes that can drive cost. And we're really working to create novel, contemporary kind of modes of living that really get at this sort of sustainable, affordable model. This project's actually multifamily, but I think really acts sort of like a row house. This was a site just off the Vine Street Expressway on the edge of Chinatown, and this was an 11-foot wide site. And this developer came to us saying, we think we can develop something here, and we actually thought they couldn't, and we had to do some real puzzling to figure it out. And we're kind of happy we could. And I think that's something we've become interested in too, is, you know, diving deeply into the zoning code and the regulatory framework to try to figure out how to get the most out of a site. And it's interesting that when we did this project originally, the zoning code, Philadelphia has a very liberal parking requirement, which is generally never more than 3 spaces per 10 units, which is pretty good by urban standards. But this project was sort of done during an early period of the new zoning code where they weren't requiring any parking until 10 units. Now they prorate the parking spaces. So this 7-unit project was as of right with no parking. And you can see, I think this is an interesting thing for us to think about, is if parking was required here, this project could have never happened, potentially, right? Because the moment you go into a variance process, the conversation changes a little bit. And literally, when we found the site, there were 2 cars parked, one on each end. So this is like a really interesting sort of lesson in kind of parking and development. And these sites, and we may have the opportunity to look at some others, were the results of cutting this highway through and leaving these leftover edges. You can see our site, 93 feet long and 11 feet wide. And we were able to use some of the affordances of the zoning code, like the bay window rule that allows you to extend 3 feet over the sidewalk, to kind of capture some additional space. And so these 7 units, when you're inside them, really feel kind of great. There's some volume here. We used like a couple of mezzanine levels to kind of capture additional space, and really you can see that top right shot. You can appreciate that 3-foot bump there on the facade that adds that extra space. Just some other images of the interior and the galley kitchen coming through the entry hallway. And so, you know, the secret to this is really this single stair, which is allowed for building of this scale. And you can see the mezzanine levels there. The very top unit is a true 2-story. This is actually a 4-story building that is 72 feet tall. Wood frame construction, single stair. So this idea that really looking at, I think there's areas within where the building code changes from different kinds of construction and different requirements, where you can match affordability with density, which is something we've become very interested in. And of course, in these single stair buildings, the stairs are important. So making sure that they're also social and interesting and inviting to people. So you can kind of get a set, and it's right along the Vine Street Expressway, which is really quite interesting, the way that you interact with the traffic, and is really kind of hanging on to the edge of Center City here. So I think and I'm hoping I'm doing okay on time, I'm going to talk about one more thing here. Here's another shot. This is our office as kind of part of the photo shoot here, occupying all the terraces. I did want to wrap by maybe talking about how we kind of go back and forth between practice and thinking, and taking the opportunity to, as architects, work on some research projects. And this was a grant through the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, where we wanted to, come back. We have spent a certain amount of time advancing the language of contemporary row houses, and really wanted to kind of reflect on some of these building bones of the city. And I think I kind of started talking about that a little bit. And we ended up working with 4 blocks, and we did these workshops where you can see here, we put a map on the table, and there was a workbook, and we invited people from the block to talk about how they came to live on the block, their favorite spot on the block. We made some drawings. We had a video booth where people shared an object to put in a time capsule that people 100 years from now, just as 100 years ago, would re-inherit their block and get passed down. And so we did this exhibition with these 4 blocks that we the idea was to show them with a sort of similarity almost with these furniture pieces, but that would hold these very different stories These were the 4 blocks that we exhibited, one from West Philly, North Philly, South Philly. It was really remarkable to talk to neighbors about how important their block was. Everybody had the best block. There was a sense of incredible camaraderie that spanned income levels and backgrounds, and there was a kind of community and a kind of ownership that sort of sprung from that, which we think has been going on in the city for 200 years and will hopefully continue to go on. And I think, one of the things that I wanted to convey, we think of architects as sort of designers, but this idea, particularly in a city like Philadelphia, where there's a lot of as of right development, meaning it's a little different than Boston, where there's a little less oversight. The zoning code is celebrated for allowing a lot to happen on its own. But what we've realized is that puts a lot of responsibility on the architect, that we have a lot of tough conversations with clients where, just because you can do it doesn't mean you should, is something we've been saying a lot recently, and really helping them to think through how their work shapes the city, because their work happens fast. While we're all thinking about how to rewire the top-down regulations of what's allowed, a lot gets built. I just wanted to mention that Row House Workshop is moving to Appalachian State University. In fact, they came to pick it up this morning. And what's really cool is it's going to move to Boone, North Carolina, which is a very different context than Philadelphia. And we hope to have some panels and some discussions and workshops around what these 2 places can learn from each other and how communities are shaped. This is the Instagram handle. All of this work is on the Instagram, and invite you to go check it out. Thank you.
Terrific. Wandy?
Great. Hi, everybody. And I will go ahead and also share my screen. But first want to say thank you for the incredible invitation to be a part of this discussion today. I really look forward to unpacking some of these larger questions and sort of like ideas that have surfaced over the past few presentations. And yeah, I think, Brian, this is actually an incredible segue because I feel like some of the work that we'll be talking about is similar to the sort of like row house typology, but really taking a look at our more vernacular typologies right here in Boston. And so I will actually start by saying that I think that as I was piecing this presentation together for today, I really I feel like the title of the class series actually really struck me. So thinking about creating beautiful, just, and resilient places in America, and actually thinking that an interesting entry point for me is that I was born and mostly raised in Luanda, Angola. And so I think that there were a lot of different learned lessons, right, that I was able to sort of make connections to right here within the Boston context. And so I am trained as an architect, and I think that throughout my architectural academic experience, I really gravitated towards the vernacular and found a passion within vernacular architecture and practices, and have really begun to think about its role in being a symbol of liberation, of resilience, of resistance as well, of a people's history. Yes, in the context of Angola, in terms of a newly independent nation, but also right here in the Boston and the people that we know reside here as well. And so just to take a quick step back in thinking about the definition of vernacular architecture overall, so Arc Daily a few years ago had released this article around vernacular architecture in the 21st century and the sort of like learned lessons that can come from these practices that might be more environmentally conscious, more affordable in some cases as well, and thinking about locally sourced materials and labor and how we're building different forms. But really this definition that they mentioned, right, that it's the simplest form of addressing human needs. And so oftentimes you can also think that whatever is simple is actually quite difficult to achieve. And there are so many sort of like hurdles that we have placed in front of our own journeys that actually limit this from being made possible in a really transparent and easy way. And so I want to essentially bring us home, right, to Boston a little bit, recognizing where we're, a few of us are situated. just providing a little bit of context. So the current population within the city of Boston, we're sort of moving onwards and upwards to reaching about 700,000 residents. We are made up of 23 quite unique neighborhoods with a variety of contexts within within each neighborhood. And also thinking about how dense the city is, right? The fourth in the nation, and also recognizing that a large percentage of the city of Boston's residents are actually foreign born, myself included. And so how are we actually thinking about addressing the needs of our current residents? And I think that there's a lot of different guidelines that we can set out for ourselves. And I just want to highlight the Housing a Changing City plan that came out of the city of Boston right around 2014, once the new mayor and our current mayor was appointed in this role, and really thinking about, you know, what are the sort of targets that we want to reach as a city to make sure that we are providing as many affordable housing options for our residents. And in this document, there was a bit about how we need to think creatively about producing and introducing new housing models and ways of creating housing in the city of Boston. So I think that this is always a good transition to sort of talk about my current role and who I work with and beside. And so my fellowship, as Anne-Marie stated earlier, is a two-part fellowship, right? It's co-hosted by both the Boston Society for Architecture, which is our local AIA chapter of AIA, and also is a nonprofit organization. And we are really tasked with sort of convening both folks within the built environment industry, but also those outside of it, and thinking about how we can bridge some of these gaps. And also the Mayor's Housing Innovation Lab, which actually came out of the Housing a Changing City plan. And we sort of take a look at different models of housing by first piloting different projects, and then trying to test to see if those outcomes can then be scalable, and how we can do that within city government as well. And so the two of these came together to then form my current fellowship. And so I have been tasked with sort of carrying out a number of projects, but really overseeing the sort of ongoing work that the two have conducted over the years, over the past 5 years, essentially since the inception of the Mayor's Housing Innovation Lab, and really recognizing that in order to create these more regulatory sort of like changes, right, and policies, we also need to make sure that there's a variety of folks at the table, and architects and designers really play a large role in this as well. So I'm here to talk about a few different projects that have come out of both the Mayor's Housing Innovation Lab and the Boston Society for Architecture. First starting with our additional dwelling unit program, and then talking a little bit about our urban housing unit, and this sort of like entry point into a conversation around compact living in the city. And then finishing off with our Future Decker exploration, which I think all of you watching will see some direct parallels to the work that Brian was also mentioning with the row house workshop. So excited to have that more expansive conversation as well. And so to begin with our additional dwelling unit program, right? So here is an opportunity to really think about different ways of bringing housing into the city, and also leaning into different processes that folks had already been doing prior to our sort of like introduction into this, right? So we knew that there were a lot of units that weren't necessarily regulated, right? But were either carved out of folks' homes, right? And we then decided to start to think about how can we facilitate the process of creating an additional dwelling unit. And so we looked at this particularly within the building envelope. So thinking about how folks might be able to transform their attic spaces, their basements, or also carving out a unit on a first floor, but also thinking about the pre-existing units that already exist, right? And converting them into truly habitable spaces as well. And so we ended up sort of like listening and paying attention to what folks were already doing and were already asking for in in the city, and then trying to partner with architects and other designers to think about how we can achieve some of these goals and start to create guidelines that can be really easy to follow. And so quite earlier on in the process, we actually connected home owners with designers to sit down, right, and start to brainstorm these different ideas of how they would like to see their spaces transform, and thinking about how they can bring an additional unit to have maybe additional income, or to be able to age in community in their homes, and just thinking about how these different services can be provided for them as well. Today, our additional dwelling unit program is now citywide. We had initially started with a pilot in 3 key neighborhoods, but now has gone citywide, and we're actually thinking about expanding beyond just this building envelope, but starting to think about exterior existing structures like carriage houses, right? And leaning into and sort of like learning the lessons from our neighbors across the United States and in numerous other cities, and how they've been able to create additional or accessory dwelling units as well. The other projects that I wanted to sort of briefly highlight was actually our urban housing units, right? And so here was an opportunity to really start to unpack a little bit about the potential benefits of thinking about smaller living spaces in the city, and also asking ourselves the question, right? Can smaller units be made feasible in the city as well? And thinking about how we create guidelines for these in different ways. But we know that it's not enough to sort of come into a community or sort of say, you know, here's what we would like to do, but to really provide opportunities for folks to experience what different spaces feel like. So we created the urban housing unit in partnership with What's In and Stantec and Live Light, to really create a unit that could be toured around different city neighborhoods, right? And allowing folks to come in and say, you know, maybe I could see myself living in this smaller space, or maybe I could see my aunt or my uncle living in this environment as well. And so there's a video, and I can make sure to sort of like link afterwards. I'm always so skeptical about playing videos while on Zoom because the sound is just always hard to sort of like follow. But we conducted also interviews with folks as they experienced, right, the urban housing unit, and getting their feedback. And I think that I always gravitate to this resident who mentioned that, right, I actually want a smaller space because somebody wouldn't be able to sort of like stay over, and I want some that sort of like privacy in this moment. So the urban housing unit was also, I would like to add that it was about 385 square feet. So just a little bit of a smaller size than our typical housing. And I think that a lot of this work really helped inform what was our first housing innovation competition. So really taking a note around what Karen was talking about previously, right, where we can create opportunities for a wide variety of stakeholders to come together and say, you know, here's an idea and here's how I would like to see this come to life. And for us, right, as the BSA, as the city of Boston and other forces, right, to pave the way to make that be a little bit more easier to sort of like achieve. But with our first housing innovation competition, we asked development teams to come together to create design ideas around what compact units could look like in Boston. And so our winning team was Dream Collaborative, and they actually ended up creating a multi-generational project, right? So that you could actually have an older adult live on the lower units, and then their families that could grow over time also live right above them. And so also thinking about, right, that health oftentimes also means that we're able to interact with one another in really safe and caring ways, right? That we're not living in isolation, that we are thinking about a variety of needs and really catering to those as well, which again are sort of these vernacular practices that are really put into effect in our cities. And lastly, I would just like to talk a little bit about our Future Decker exploration. And I will say that we were incredibly inspired by ISA's work with the Philadelphia row house, and recognizing that there are a few challenges that actually exist when we're talking about creating multifamily housing right here in Boston. And so we looked in our sort of like own backyard and examined, right, what is a building typology that has had a similar connection to a lot of folks, that is vernacular, right? Although colonial, is still vernacular to this area. And we began to host community conversations with folks to hear about their experiences with living in triple deckers, and getting a sense as to this, once deeply affordable housing type that was also inviting a large number of immigrant and working families, and providing them an opportunity to call Boston home, and thinking about how is it quite difficult to actually be able to afford a triple decker today, and how it's just difficult to transfer some of those same values into our current context. And so in these conversations, we not only asked folks to reflect on their experiences with triple deckers or three deckers or three families, right? There's a huge variety of ways to call this building type, but also asked them to envision the future of this building typology, which is why we leaned into naming this project the Future Decker Project. And so we actually have documented and truly partnered with incredible partners, including Wentworth Institute of Technology, where the students actually ended up creating their sort of designs for the Future Decker. We partnered with a number of residents throughout the city's neighborhoods and had one-on-one conversations or group conversations with them about their experiences and their visions, and ended up documenting all of this on a virtual exhibition. And so I feel like last year definitely threw us all in completely different directions than we were expecting, but we definitely found a way to continue to stay engaged with folks and share out what we were hearing as not only needs of our city residents, but also the wants, right? And recognizing that the triple decker actually was a building typology that a lot of folks said would be really interesting to think about considering for the future because of their iconic balconies, right? And how you're able to sort of live in walkable neighborhoods, and just thinking about the housing types that we can continue to create. And we also held a conversation series as a part of the programming for our virtual Future Decker exhibition. And here was an opportunity to really bring additional folks in to have a conversation about the environmental impacts of triple deckers and potentially future deckers, of the economic realities that are layered onto this as well. And we actually finished up by talking about anti-racist design strategies. And so we brought a wide group of about 60 participants to come together and actually take a look at the triple decker history through this anti-racial lens, right? So how can we actually think about trying to counter some of our racist housing policies and these legacies that are deeply embedded within the work that we are all doing now, and recognizing that we also need innovation in not just the built outcomes, but within our processes as well. So we invited folks to actually take a look at the typical housing development roadmap here in the city of Boston, and what it looks like to think about creating housing when we're talking about privately owned land or publicly owned land, and also what that journey then looks like. The sort of like middle area, maybe I can point to this yellow region here, sort of talking about zoning and permitting and community engagement, right? All of these factors that are really built into, no pun intended, our experiences in housing development, and asking folks to reimagine every step of the way of this roadmap. We received incredible feedback on how we can consider, again, health and well-being, and how we can consider affordability, and how none of these factors or all of these factors are so deeply connected, right? And that we actually are tasked with holding all of these issues and trying to come up with better solutions for the future. So this is the type of work that we definitely continue to do. And I think that whether it's the ADUs or the urban housing units or the future deckers, right, there's something truly to be learned about our vernacular practices. And so I just want to end with this final question that perhaps can sort of like lead us into this discussion, right? How can we continue to learn from our vernacular past, our present, and also our futures to really advance housing for the health and well-being of our communities? And so, thank you.
Terrific. I gather you folks have some questions for each other even before we get to questions that have come in from folks who are on this call. So who wants to start?
I could. I wanted, I mean, you know, Wandy, I appreciate your discussion around the limits of design, meaning design within a flawed system or a system that sets up some unsolvable challenges through design is one that design can maybe make look better. I mean, to some degree, maybe even hide some of the problems that are deeper in the way that development happens and cities develop. I guess I have my own thinking about this in my experience, but I'd love to hear maybe, I think you alluded to this a little bit, you mentioned some things, but maybe to highlight one of the things that you identified maybe through the triple decker work that would say, you know, this is a stoppage in you know, being able to realize the kind of innovation maybe we think would unlock affordability or speed of production or sustainability or the things that you were looking at.
Sorry, Brian, can you repeat your question just once more?
Oh yeah, sorry, was I coming in and out? Was my speaker okay?
No, I'm just trying to make sure that I completely like.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I guess maybe just identify, sorry, I was rambling. Maybe just to pinpoint one of the issues you guys identified maybe in the triple decker work about a regulatory or process problem and maybe allowing design or development to realize some of the qualities you guys were looking for in a more just, sustainable, affordable type.
Yeah. So thank you for also clarifying that.
Yeah.
I think that there's definitely this question around replicability, right? And that I think that there's a few different hurdles that we sort of come across, right? When triple deckers were first introduced, we could sort of there's so many archival images of just, triple deckers being able to fill up entire blocks, right? And that it truly was this replicable model that was done in an affordable way. And then folks could then be able to purchase an entire home. And then, maybe you could have a large family live on one of the units and then rent it out to additional folks and then have some sort of income to be able to meet their mortgage requirements. I think that today, the city of Boston is quite different in the sense that we don't have as much land as we once had, right? So the cost of land is actually quite high, as is the cost of labor as well. And so I think that there's definitely an opportunity to think about, what sort of design models and technologies can we actually think about introducing that can facilitate and lessen that sort of economic impact up front, so that the built outcome can be more affordable for the same similar demographics that it once was able to sort of cater to.
Yeah. We have a ton of questions that have come in from the audience, and I don't necessarily want to do a lightning round, but I do want to try to get to as many of the questions that have come in as possible. Starting with a question of what the breakdown of the housing has been as between owner-occupied and rental units. Let's start with Karen on that.
Sure, yeah, I just popped that in the chat. There were 222 units total, and 151 of those were rental at, I think I'm gonna get this right, 30 to 60% AMI, and the rest were ownership at 70 to 100 AMI. And I'll put the link to my Domus article, which talks more about this.
Great. What's the projected lifespan of these new housing forms? 20 years, 50 years, 100 years? I mean, the triple decker has been around for certainly a century. Started as single family homes, many of them, and then became multiple units. What are you projecting is the likely lifespan of this new form of building?
I mean, from my perspective, I'll just say that that's a big topic of conversation in Philadelphia, where row houses built literally out of triple wide brick walls. I mean, you know, like apparently, like after the fire of London, all the Masons moved to Philadelphia when they had done their new work and just built a city of brick. And it's those houses, you know, will last literally hundreds of years. I think there's an interesting tension between contemporary building techniques, the cost of labor, as was mentioned, affordability, and longevity. And I think we've sort of, I think without question, and I mean this in a positive way, I'm not sure that our row houses will last as long as those triple wide brick row houses that were built in the early 19th century. And I wonder, you know, I think it's this equation of what the moment is and how you provide the best housing you can. And I think, I'm not sure it's a bad thing. I think it's sort of the thing I find interesting about the way row house blocks work is pieces come in and out through time. And I think we're very interested in this layer that helps to create everyday housing for everyday people. And it's going to look a little different and be built in a different way maybe than we have in the past.
You know, we have a number of questions that have come in that are very, I would say, large scale. One person asked how we get the private sector, particularly the financial institutions, the insurance companies, and folks other than the architects involved in not only thinking about, but investing in these kinds of properties. And when I say it's a large scale question, we run courses that cover all of this because the incentives that are available are multiple and complex and often require, as I know is the case with all of your projects, that the developer assemble very different and complex combinations of financing and regulatory incentives. So how is it that you've managed to get private investment in the projects that you've done, and how do you see creating more incentives for that?
Maybe I'll answer that question obliquely, maybe. So Via Verde, you know, like almost all affordable housing projects, has significant subsidy and government subsidy at different levels. And because it was such a high profile project with a lot of people sort of invested, there's more little, you know, pieces like from the borough president and different levels of government investing in this. And we know that, you know, if you look at a truly equitable housing system anywhere, which we do not have in the United States, you know, try to prove me wrong, you absolutely need massive public investment. And so that question is important. I'm very encouraged by, you know, a readiness just in examining the potentials for much greater public investment. Brian and his partner at ISA contributed an article to my book, Housing as Intervention, and I was happy to hear that it's landed in the hands of people working on the Green New Deal for public housing, looking at, you know, very large scale and thinking about not only great investment, but also absolutely beautiful green housing, the kind of stuff that, you know, the people on this panel today are working on. So that's really what I'm focusing on in my work.
Yeah, and I just have to add, as a person who sits on Boston's planning board, that Wandy raised a very crucial issue in terms of increasing public investment in housing. The federal government basically walked away from making public investment decades ago. You know, this was not something that started 4 or 5 years ago. This goes back to the 1970s. And so incentives have been created to get private investment into the affordable housing market. But one of the points that Wandy made about this is that there are nearly 60,000 people who've moved to Boston since Mayor Walsh became mayor. He and the administration are very proud of the fact that they have built the largest number of publicly supported housing units of any city in America, and the highest number of affordable units of any city in America. But between them, that's only a bit more than 30,000 units. So if you have 50 or 60,000 new people move in, but you've only created 30,000 new units, how do you keep up with that? And how do you stay ahead of it? And how do you prevent gentrification from occurring, being driven by market forces? How have your solutions addressed those kinds of issues? The population is increasing and it's become much more diverse. How do you deal with that?
Was that a question? Was that a question, Ted?
Yes.
I mean, one thing I'll say, and I think we're getting to it now, right? Which is that, like, you know, it takes some big thinking and some big movements to really get at some impactful solutions. But one of the things I wanted to highlight in my share today was there's, you know, you can come at it from the big scale and you can come at it from the teeny scale. And I think we've been really we've been doing our best, and the impacts are small, but you know, if we can get 7 units on a site that maybe someone else would have found 4 on, or, you know, what's interesting about some of this tiny infill development is it doesn't maybe solve for the big picture, but a small developer who's using a local bank and a local contractor can opt their pro forma to look in a way that's more personal to them. And it's not to say that they're not making money, but it's to say that sometimes we see in bigger projects that's being financed out of a bank in another part of the US or another country, their guidelines for what they'll accept are just, they're not up for discussion. And I think we've had luck with, you know, the guys funding a project or girls funding a project sitting at the table with us, and we're talking about what the impact of the project will be. And I think we can get something a little better when we have FaceTime with the people that are actually doing it. So I'll just, you know, it doesn't solve maybe the big picture, and it doesn't, as Karen say, solve the fundamental issues we have in this country with housing. But as an architect that has to get up in the morning and watch shovels go in the ground, you know, it's almost like, in the meantime, what's the best we can do? And I know that sounds like not enough, but that does still get us up in the morning, is what do we do with our energy today? And if we can get an extra unit, or if we can change someone's mind about, you know, what their expectations are of the project, or if we can have the city look favorably on a gray area of the zoning code or whatever they are looking for to benefit, hopefully, a community, you know, there's also that side of the equation, I think.
We're talking about 3 northeastern cities, Philly, New York, and Boston. What are the challenges you faced in developing micro units in each of those places?
I could definitely get us started on this. I think that perception was truly a large one, right? And sort of, I think that our history and the legacies of smaller living are still so present today in thinking about tenement housing and these sort of like legacies and associations that folks also make to smaller living. And I think that the sort of like way that we've gone about this was to really tell this narrative in perhaps a slightly different way, and thinking about, you know, what are some of the benefits that actually can be associated with this that aren't only rooted in the sort of like housing affordability perspective and lens, but also saying that, you know, here's a way that some folks actually want to live as well, and creating the room for those discussions to take place. And I think that also, in addition, was to really showcase that that there are ways that we can create healthy and habitable guidelines around this, that we won't just allow for anything to be built at a smaller scale, and we'll actually say, right, is this housing being built near transit, right? So that we're talking about lowering parking requirements. Are we also creating shared spaces where folks can interact with one another, so that there aren't sort of like staying in isolation in these smaller spaces, but have an opportunity to do that? And also, are there green spaces that they can have access to, whether that's actually built within the housing project itself, or in the sort of like vicinity of where they live? So I think that a lot of storytelling and narrative building around this was actually quite necessary to show folks that this is a way that some folks in the city, not everybody, wants to live in, and how do we make it possible for them as well?
I got to be involved in an amazing project in New York. I was not the designer of this, but I got to design a hypothetical project that was in the Museum of the City of New York show called Making Room, sponsored by the Architectural League and Citizen Housing Planning Council. And that started with the premise, it said, listen, only, our housing stock in New York and many other cities is really geared toward the nuclear family, but only 17% of households in New York fit that description. So what about everyone else? What about, our job as designers was to break housing regulations on purpose, to show what could we have if we had looser regulations, both for sort of micro units and for shares. And from that advocacy came the My Micro project, now known as Carmel Place. So I think it's really interesting. I also think, in New York, literally the housing department has shrunk its regulations for what constitutes a minimum habitable dwelling. And I think it's important also to question whether shrinking is always the right thing to do. There's a profit motive, of course. Developers make so much, they make more per square foot when you have a building full of micro units. And I think especially with the pandemic, I think, I'm glad I'm not having to make these policies. They're very difficult. But thinking about, how much do we want to shrink what livable means, and how can we make sure that everyone really truly does have healthy housing?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are parts of the world where 300 square foot units are considered almost a norm. Brian, you were going to say?
I was just going to really quickly say, I think just following up on this, that I really appreciated Wandy's share of the urban housing unit, because when we did our first 100K house, it was the same thing, where there were lots of naysayers about, would somebody buy it? It's too small, there's not enough doors. But when one was built and people could go in and see themselves in this new kind of environment, it was very impactful. And I just think that ability for people to experience a prototype, I think, is an interesting way for designers to move the needle on expectations and this idea of new forms and new types.
For people in our audience who have not studied urban residential design, could one of you comment on how it was that the dumbbell-shaped tenement came into being? Wasn't that a response to earlier health and safety issues?
Sure. So before you had the dumbbell, you would have housing that really took up the whole block, the whole lot. So that meant that there were a lot of spaces, like basically, the majority of the interior would not have access to light and air. Other issues in terms of lack of proper access to sanitation. And so the dumbbell, sorry, I'm like drawing it on the screen, but what it does is specifically there's light and air. You narrow at the middle around the stair to allow more light and air, and you pull back to introduce a rear yard to also introduce light and air that way. And so it was put in the building code. So future tenements had to be built that way. So raising the level of quality. And it's interesting too, because, that story is usually told as a benevolent story. There were poor people who were sick, and so the government wanted to improve their housing stock. In fact, it's more complicated. It was people with more money and more political power who were worried about tuberculosis and similar diseases coming into their neighborhoods. And so it was something where, you know, they would benefit, everyone would benefit if people had healthier housing across the board. So it's a really interesting story and really important, I think, especially now. You know, I used to tell this story and say, oh, this is the olden times. We don't worry about this stuff anymore. Now it's diabetes, but okay, yeah, we do have to worry about, anyways.
Yeah, and a lot
Infectious
of people
diseases.
are talking about what we have learned from COVID in relation to health and safety and overcrowding and the like, and also what we've learned in terms of anti-racist policies. One of the questions that has come in is for Wandy, but any of you can respond to this. What are the anti-racist design interventions that you have identified that have come up from community members through the work you've done? And a related question is, how have you dealt with community pushback on some of the ideas that you've put forward here?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely noticed that question. And I think that when we held that workshop, we were really taking a look also at not just the development, right, of a particular project or the design of a particular project, but really how the housing development roadmap has been designed, and something that, you know, is a part of the system that we're all sort of like now playing into as well. And so some of the things that we heard in that space were, it really ranged, right? We were talking about the sort of like inaccessible language that can sometimes be found in our documents, right? Thinking about requests for proposals, and is there an opportunity to consider, right, changing that language to make it more inviting and also more comprehensive for folks. To also thinking about, you know, something that came up a lot was actually the role of the public architect, somebody that can act as the bridge between community residents and, you know, a city entity or an institutional entity as well, and what that sort of like advocacy looks like. And I think that in Boston, we actually have truly great examples of that, right? I'm thinking about Villa Vittoria, right? And the sort of like role that John Sharon and other folks did in partnering with local community development corporations, in this case, IBA or Madison Park, and thinking about what sort of design properties would you like to see in your own neighborhood that can improve the qualities of life, and taking a look also at, again, thinking about vernacular building types, right? And building types that were familiar to folks, that really cultivated their sort of cultural practices, and that it was very out there and sort of like in alignment with both what the people wanted and also what sort of like requirements were coming out of the city. And then I think to answer your the second question, Ted, around pushback, right? I think that anytime we enter a space and that we have to sort of like retell a narrative, I think that there is room for pushback if that narrative doesn't necessarily resonate, or oftentimes if we're not acknowledging the sort of issues that have been placed upon in the systems and how they've impacted folks over time, right? If we are entering a community and sort of saying, right, we can talk about micro units or we can talk about additional dwelling units, and decontextualizing it to the history of the city, we run into a moment where we can actually continue to break down trust between residents and the city as well. And so I think that there's a lot of work of repair that still needs to be done, and that's something that we actively try to do.
We have time for just a handful of questions, and we will run over tonight, but we'll finish within another 10 minutes or so. There's a question for Karen. Could you elaborate a bit on the relationship between health and design in the project that you did in the Bronx?
Oops. Sure thing. Yes. So I think this is such an important question. In fact, I think it's the most important question. You know, the health inequities in our country are completely unacceptable, and so part of this is large scale. You know, we know that where you live is the greatest predictor of your health. And we know that just at the basic level, right, if Via Verde were any well-designed project that was affordable, research shows that, you know, it improves your health. And specifically in Via Verde, there's a number of different parts of the project. There's from a programmatic level, there's literally a health clinic on the ground floor. There's a gym that residents can use. The whole building is a gym if you want to climb the stairs. I wonder how many people do that, but you could. And also literally the production of healthy food. And then things like, you know, it's finer grain, healthy materials. You know, that little ceiling fan is so, you know, not a big deal, but it was, the developer hadn't had those before in their projects, and after they did. So you have cross ventilation and also an, you know, an energy, a positive energy, you know, result from that. So a lot of different, so I'm talking about sort of physical health, and then, you know, better and better research shows the degree to which social cohesion is such an important metric when looking at health. And so to have, you know, so often in a housing development, the communal spaces are kind of like as small as it, because you can't rent those, right? So to have a really absolutely generous, beautifully designed courtyard that's shared by, you know, all the people, 222 units from 30% AMI to 100, all of them share that courtyard, which is also programmed with, you know, public or semi-public programs. So those are some of the main ways that Via Verde contributes to health. And also, if someone's interested, looking more at the city's active design guidelines, talks more about that at different scales.
We have a simple question that necessitates a much lengthier answer than we can provide now, but it goes to the life cycle of these kinds of buildings. How's the longevity of the property factored into the assessment of sustainability? And what are the factors that architects and builders are now looking to in terms of assessing sustainability? And then we'll have one more question after that. But sustainability, how do you assess it without taking a lengthy design or engineering?
You want to take that? I mean, I could take it. You can take it.
On performance.
Just real quickly, I think we've moved a little bit away from formal rating systems like LEED and into a more self-directed goal, particularly with private developers, where we're focused on energy, because, you know, LEED actually provides a lot. If you're in the core of Boston or Philly, it's gotten a little better, but like you can be LEED Silver without being very energy efficient by having no garage. And, you know, it's sort of like for urban areas, you have to dial it up. So, you know, we've been really focused on good windows and air sealing and HVAC systems and just envelopes. And in, you know, Philadelphia with the row house, you take 2 walls out to start, which is extremely green. But then also just, you know, getting as much attainability in the infill projects we can do, meaning reusing existing infrastructure and getting as much access to as many people as possible to living in places that are walkable and have amenities. And I think, you know, it's a tall goal, but that's what we've really been focusing on, and really trying to not, you know, focus on highly energy efficient buildings that may or may not be connected to anything, but looking at buildings that are in the fabric, that are as affordable and, you know, energy efficient as possible, with energy efficiency, of course, being a way to lower the monthly cost of the owner, as really, I think, the #1, you know, priority.
And we'll conclude with a question from Tim Love, who is one of our architecture school faculty who's been very involved in urban design issues. And this goes to Brian. Do the leftover site projects that you've done work financially because the sites are so narrow that other developers aren't interested in building on them, resulting in super low land values and site acquisition costs? How do those small sites work financially, and how do you get them to work in the long term?
Yeah, Well, it's a good question, and I mean, we certainly don't have it figured out, and each site at this point is its own challenge. But Tiny Tower, its construction cost, I think, was around 250,000. Which pushes that house probably into the fours, in a neighborhood of lots of houses in the sixes and sevens. So I think it, just by nature of its scale and solving, I think it's a lower margin. I will say that Excess House, I think, is a more promising, more obvious solution to affordability, because that lot literally was very inexpensive, and to put 7 units on it was, I think, a victory. And I do want to just make this comment to sort of add complexity to Tim's point, which I think is, the financing is, challenging. That site was master leased by a short stay hotel company. And, the thing that kind of bummed me out about that is it's not available to local Philadelphians to rent as of right now. And I'm sure that developer feels very happy about that deal to a year and a half ago, given what's happening right now. But I think there are a lot of forces around these projects that, even if you think you've solved it from one side, there's a whole bunch of other things that can happen that really change the way that particular project comes into sort of fulfilling housing needs. So it's a work in progress, Tim.
And a question came in earlier as to whether any of these projects are handicap accessible, and how do you address that? Anyone?
Yeah, Via Verde, I mean, definitely follows ADA, and I think it's interesting. There's a lot of stairs and active design imagery, and so I think some people have the idea that active design is contrary to accessibility, but that's certainly not the case. So I'm glad someone asked that, because always, of course, it's so important to include elevator access and other kinds of accessibility for people who need it.
And I'll just make one final comment and a bit of a corrective. The expression was used that when the mayor was appointed, and I remind folks that the mayors here are not appointed. In fact, they're elected. And in Boston, we've only had 3 mayors in the last 40 years. And we're up for an election this fall. And we don't know how long the person who will be elected this fall will choose to serve, but it is certainly the case that if there's a desire for affecting and changing building patterns and regulatory processes, we can look back and we see that there's more innovation going on in building practices now than was the case a decade ago, but the change has been slow. And if we want to see more change, then it seems to me all of the candidates who've put themselves forward need to come up with specific answers to those kinds of questions. It's not just enough to say that we want to overcome patterns of gentrification. The question is how. It's not enough to say that we need more affordable housing. The question is, how do we get there with the kinds of public and private resources that we have at this moment? So I'm very grateful to our panelists tonight and to Anne-Marie for helping us begin to raise a set of really hard questions, the answers to which the electorate in Boston will be able to affect over the course of the coming 8 to 10 months. And it's a reminder that folks need to register and vote and become actively engaged in our community processes. So with that, I'll turn this back over to Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Ted. And I know New York City has a mayoral election coming up as well. And as I recall, after Mayor Menino announced he was not going to run for another term, the Boston Society of Architects was one of many organizations to host a mayoral candidates forum, which helped to ensure that design was part of the conversation. So I think that's very important. So thank you, Wandy and Brian and Karen, for this extraordinary session and very rich conversation. As with all of these sessions, we could easily plan a whole semester's worth of conversation about it. But thank you tonight for introducing those topics. And thank you to the BSA for offering the AIA CEUs. Next week, we are going to be taking on the topic of community university partnerships. So we'll be hearing from Jason Shupak, who's now with Drexel University, and Maria Rosario Jackson from Arizona State University. We'll talk about the roles of creative placemaking and university community collaboration in shaping downtown Phoenix and Philadelphia. And they'll also highlight Civic Space Park, which is a Rudy Bruner Award winner in Phoenix. I also wanted to remind people that these sessions are recorded, so you can see them once they're available on the Myra Kraft website. We will also post them on our Rudy Bruner website, along with links to the case studies we highlight, in this case, Via Verde, and other resources that Wandy, Brian, and Karen have shared with us. And just one final shout out to Via Verde. One of the outcomes of that project has been a health indicator study as well. So there is data being collected. So I think that's something that's very important in terms of our architectural work and helping to make the case for the value of these design considerations. So thank you, everybody, and we hope you can join us next week. Good night.
Good night.